The farmer standing in his field near Faro, North Carolina, didn't see the plane at first. It was just after midnight on January 24, 1961, and the sky above the rural countryside was a canvas of absolute darkness. He heard it before he saw it, a screaming metallic tear in the atmosphere that sounded like the earth itself was splitting open. Then came the light. It wasn't the warm glow of a sunrise, but a violent, artificial strobe that illuminated the swampy ground with the intensity of a welding torch. High above him, a B-52G Stratofortress, call sign Keep 19, was disintegrating. The massive bomber, carrying a payload that could erase the entire eastern seaboard, was spinning uncontrollably, its structural integrity failing under aerodynamic forces it was never designed to withstand. As the farmer watched in paralyzed horror, the fuselage broke apart, raining burning debris across tobacco fields and forests. But amidst the falling aluminum and jet fuel, two objects separated from the wreckage. They tumbled through the darkness, heavy, sleek, and terrifyingly purposeful. They were Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs. Each one carried a yield of 3.8 megatons, 250 times more powerful than the weapon that leveled Hiroshima. And they were armed. This is not a story from a science fiction novel or a what-if scenario dreamt up by conspiracy theorists. It is the documented account of the closest the United States ever came to accidentally detonating a hydrogen bomb on its own soil. For decades, the Pentagon described the Goldsboro incident as a minor accident, a tragedy where 3 brave airmen lost their lives, but where the public was never in real danger. They lied. When the classified documents were finally released under the Freedom of Information Act years later, they revealed a chilling reality that turned the blood of nuclear safety experts cold. The bomb that landed in a muddy field that night didn't just fall, it went through its full detonation sequence. The arming wires were pulled, the pulse generator activated, the pilot chute deployed, the barometric switches closed. Out of 4 safety mechanisms designed to prevent a nuclear apocalypse, 3 failed. The only thing standing between the United States and a crater wide enough to swallow a city was a single low-voltage switch, a piece of technology that cost less than $1. To understand how the world arrived at this precipice, one must understand the era. It was the height of the Cold War. The United States Air Force Strategic Air Command, under the iron-fisted leadership of General Curtis LeMay, was operating on a war footing 24 hours a day. The doctrine was simple: keep nuclear weapons in the air constantly, ready to strike the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. Operation Chrome Dome kept B-52 bombers loitering near the Soviet borders around the clock. These crews were tired, flying missions that lasted 24 hours or more, carrying weapons of unimaginable destruction as if they were commuting to an office job. Keep 19 was part of this airborne alert force. Commanded by Captain Walter Tulloch, the bomber had taken off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base earlier that day. The flight was routine until the rendezvous with the aerial refueling tanker. As the B-52 hooked up to take on fuel, the boom operator on the tanker noticed fuel gushing from the bomber's right wing. A leak. Not a drip, but a hemorrhage. Captain Tulloch was ordered to abort the mission and enter a holding pattern off the coast to burn off fuel before attempting a landing. It was a standard procedure. But as the massive aircraft circled, the leak worsened. The fuel imbalance made the plane heavy on one side, and the pilots fought the controls to keep it level. Then, without warning, the right wing simply gave up. The structural spar snapped. The wing sheared off. The bomber, suddenly losing half its lift, entered a violent, flat spin. The G-forces inside the cockpit were immediate and brutal, pinning the crew to the walls. In the chaos, Tulloch gave the order to bail out. 5 men managed to eject. 3 died in the crash. But as the plane broke apart in midair, the bomb bay doors were torn open by the centrifugal force. The 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs were flung into the night sky, untethered and free. The Mark 39 was a monster of a weapon. Weighing nearly 9,000 pounds and measuring 12 feet long, it was designed to destroy hardened Soviet targets. But it was also designed with a series of fail-safes, interlocks, intended to ensure that the weapon could only detonate when deliberately released by a crew over a target. The engineers at Sandia National Laboratories had built these safeties with redundancy in mind. The arm/safe switch in the cockpit had to be turned. The release handle had to be pulled. The bomb had to sense that it was falling. It had to sense the correct air pressure. It had to sense the ground approaching via radar. Only when all these tumblers clicked into place would the nuclear core ignite. But the engineers had designed these systems for a controlled drop, not a catastrophic mid-air breakup. As bomb number 1 tumbled through the air, the violent forces of the crash fooled its internal computer. The bomb didn't know the plane had disintegrated. It thought it had been dropped on a mission. As the weapon fell, the arming wires yanked out, just as they would during a combat drop. This was step 1. The bomb's internal battery powered up. Step 2. The barometric switches, sensing the rapid change in altitude, closed the circuit. Step 3. At this point, the bomb was fully alive. It was waking up, running its checklist, preparing to unleash the power of the sun. The only thing preventing the firing signal from reaching the nuclear core was the cockpit arm/safe switch. In a normal drop, the pilot would have turned this switch to arm before release. In the crash, the switch was still set to safe. However, the physical violence of the breakup had damaged the wiring. The massive jolt could have easily short-circuited the system, sending a false arm signal. Bomb number 1 slammed into the ground near a tree line, landing nearly upright. It buried itself deep in the mud, but did not detonate. When the Explosive Ordnance Disposal (EOD) team arrived hours later, they approached the weapon with the kind of terror that usually accompanies a death sentence. They saw the parachute was deployed. They saw the nose was buried. And then, Lieutenant Jack Revell, the EOD officer in charge, looked at the safeties. Revell would later recall the moment his heart stopped. He examined the arming indicator on the side of the weapon. It had moved past safe. It had moved past armed. It was resting on the final position, fire. The bomb had done everything it was supposed to do. The parachute had slowed it down to give the delivery plane time to escape the blast radius. The radar had sensed the ground. The firing capacitors had charged. The only reason Revell and the entire state of North Carolina weren't instantly vaporized was that the physical impact with the ground had damaged a single, high-voltage switch before the firing signal could travel through it. It was a matter of milliseconds. If the bomb had hit a rock instead of soft mud, or if the angle had been slightly different, the connection might have held long enough for the signal to pass. But the horror wasn't over. There was a second bomb. Bomb number 2 had behaved differently. When it was thrown from the spinning wreckage, its parachute failed to deploy. Without the drag of the chute, the weapon became a kinetic missile, screaming toward the earth at the speed of sound. It slammed into a muddy field with such velocity that it didn't just bury itself, it liquefied the ground on impact. The bomb tunneled nearly 50 feet into the swampy soil. The force of the impact was so great that the weapon disintegrated underground. The conventional explosives, the trigger designed to compress the plutonium core, detonated on impact. This wasn't a nuclear explosion, but a conventional blast that scattered radioactive plutonium across the farmer's field. When the recovery teams arrived at the crater of bomb number 2, they found a nightmare scenario. They began digging, trying to recover the nuclear core and the critical physics package, the secondary stage that creates the thermonuclear yield. They dug for days in the freezing rain and mud. They found the tail section. They found twisted metal, but they couldn't find the core. The water table in the swamp was too high. The hole kept filling with muddy slurry as fast as they could pump it out. It was quicksand. The bomb components were sinking deeper, moving away from them into the earth. But as they sifted through the recovered pieces of bomb number 2, they found something that made the situation with bomb number 1 look almost safe. They found the arm/safe switch from the second bomb. Recall that on bomb number 1, 3 of the 4 safety switches had failed, and only the cockpit switch had saved the day. On bomb number 2, the impact was so violent that the cockpit switch was irrelevant. The switch they recovered from the mud was set to armed. The shock of the crash had jolted the mechanism into the firing position. Why hadn't it detonated? Because the parachute failed. By slamming into the ground at supersonic speed, the bomb destroyed its own electronics before the firing capacitor could charge. It was a paradox of survival. The failure of the safety parachute was the only reason the bomb didn't work. If the parachute had opened, the bomb would have slowed down. The electronics would have survived the descent. And since the switch was jarred to armed, it likely would have detonated as an airburst weapon, the most destructive type of nuclear explosion. The military cordon around Goldsboro tightened. The Air Force told the press it was a simple crash. They downplayed the presence of the weapons, stating there was no danger of nuclear explosion. Behind the scenes, the panic was absolute. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, demanded daily updates. President Kennedy was briefed. They knew they had dodged a bullet, but they didn't know how close the bullet had come until the engineers analyzed the switches. When the report finally crossed the desk of the weapons designers at Sandia, the blood drained from their faces. They realized that the safety mechanisms they had trusted, the barometric switches, the G-force sensors, were woefully inadequate for accident scenarios. They had designed the bombs to be safe in the bomb bay, not safe when being hurled from a disintegrating aircraft at 10,000 feet. The recovery of bomb number 2 became a futile effort. The uranium and plutonium secondary stage, the part responsible for the massive fusion explosion, had sunk too deep. After weeks of digging, battling the water table and the radioactive mud, the Air Force made a decision that sounds incredible today. They gave up. They couldn't get the bomb out, so they did the only thing they could do. They bought the land. The U.S. government purchased the easement for the field, filled in the massive hole with concrete and dirt, and erected a fence. To this day, the thermonuclear heart of a hydrogen bomb lies buried roughly 180 feet beneath a quiet field in North Carolina. It is still there. If you drive past the site today, there is no massive warning sign, no armed guards, just a quiet patch of land that the government owns and monitors for radiation. The legacy of the Goldsboro incident is not just a buried weapon. It is the terrifying realization of fragility. The B-52 was the pride of the fleet. The Mark 39 was the pinnacle of weapons engineering. And yet, a fuel leak and a gust of wind brought the system to its knees. The investigation revealed that the arm/safe switch, the hero of bomb number 1, was not a robust, heavy-duty piece of military hardware. It was a standard industrial toggle switch, similar to what you might find on a household appliance or a radio. It wasn't hardened against EMP. It wasn't shielded against massive G-forces. It was a component that could be bought at a hardware store. And the fate of millions of people rested on its internal spring not snapping. The blast radius of a 3.8 megaton detonation is difficult to comprehend. If the bomb had detonated, the fireball alone would have been 2 miles wide. Anything inside that sphere, trees, houses, people, soil, would have ceased to exist instantly, converted into plasma. The thermal radiation, the heat wave, would have caused third-degree burns to exposed skin 20 miles away. The shock wave would have leveled brick buildings 10 miles from ground zero. But the fallout would have been the true killer. The wind that night was blowing inland. A plume of lethal radioactive ash would have drifted north, blanketing Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and potentially reaching New York City. The dead zone would have been uninhabitable for decades. Agriculture in the entire region would have collapsed. The political consequences are impossible to calculate. Would the U.S. have assumed it was a Soviet first strike? Would they have launched a retaliatory strike before realizing their own bomb had caused the explosion? It is entirely possible that a fuel leak over North Carolina could have triggered World War III. This close call forced a complete redesign of America's nuclear arsenal. It led to the invention of the Permissive Action Link, PAL, a coded locking system that prevents a weapon from being armed without a specific code from the president. Before Goldsboro, the keys to the bombs were effectively in the hands of the pilots. After Goldsboro, the engineers realized that physics and accidents were as big a threat as the Soviets. They realized that safe is a relative term. The Mark 39s were eventually retired, dismantled, and replaced with safer designs. But the ghost of Keep 19 remains. It remains in the soil of North Carolina, and it remains in the classified safety reports that state, in dry, technical language, just how thin the line between survival and extinction really is. The farmer who watched the sky split open that night lived the rest of his life on top of a nuclear graveyard, knowing that the only reason he was alive was that a cheap switch held fast while a billion-dollar plane fell apart. The silence that descended upon the muddy fields of Faro, North Carolina, in the days following the crash of Keep 19 was deceptive. To the casual observer, it looked like a typical aircraft salvage operation. Trucks churning up the dirt, men in uniforms shouting orders, the metallic clatter of debris being hauled away. But beneath the veneer of a standard cleanup lay a terrifying secret that the United States government was desperate to contain. The perimeter established by the Air Force wasn't just to keep souvenir hunters away. It was to contain a radiological nightmare that threatened to spark a panic across the eastern seaboard. While the public was told that the B-52 was carrying unarmed nuclear weapons, a technical truth that masked a horrifying reality, the men on the ground were staring into the abyss. The explosive lenses of the bombs had shattered, scattering plutonium dust into the waterlogged soil. This was not the clean, invisible radiation of a reactor leak. This was alpha-emitting heavy metal, a toxic killer that could be inhaled or ingested. The young airmen and soldiers from nearby Camp Lejeune, drafted into the cleanup effort, were often working with minimal protective gear, sifting through the muck for pieces of the deadliest machine ever built. They were told to look for shiny objects, a euphemism for the beryllium and plutonium components that formed the pit of the hydrogen bombs. The recovery of the parachute-retarded weapon, Bomb Number 1, had been a masterclass in terrified precision. But the saga of Bomb Number 2, the one that had tunneled into the swamp, was becoming a slow-motion disaster. The Air Force brought in heavy excavation equipment, turning the tobacco field into an open-pit mine. They dug 20 feet, then 30, then 40. The water table was relentless. Every shovel of dirt removed was instantly replaced by a slurry of radioactive mud. The bomb had not just crashed, it had effectively buried itself in a fluid tomb. The engineers calculated the trajectory and realized the weapon had likely broken apart upon entry, sending the heavy, dense uranium secondary stage plunging even deeper than the lighter casing. They were chasing a ghost that was sinking away from them. After weeks of futile effort, with the hole growing dangerously unstable and the radiation levels in the groundwater becoming a concern, the decision was made to seal the tomb. It was a surrender to physics. The Air Force poured concrete into the excavation, officially abandoning the thermonuclear heart of the weapon to the earth. They purchased the land rights, establishing a permanent easement that forbade digging or drilling. It was a bureaucratic solution to an apocalyptic problem. Simply buy the apocalypse and fence it off. While the physical cleanup was messy, the political cleanup was ruthless. In Washington, the reaction to the Goldsboro incident was a mixture of relief and absolute fury. The newly inaugurated president, John F. Kennedy, was briefed on the incident shortly after taking office. Kennedy, who had campaigned on closing the missile gap and projecting American strength, was suddenly confronted with the fragility of the American nuclear triad. The report detailing the failure of the safety switches was a cold shower for the administration. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a man obsessed with data and systems analysis, was horrified. He realized that the greatest threat to the United States might not be a Soviet first strike, but an American accident. The concept of broken arrow, the military code for a nuclear accident, moved from a theoretical possibility to a terrifying probability. McNamara ordered a review of the entire nuclear stockpile, and the results were sobering. The weapons were safe in storage, but once they were strapped to a vibrating, pressurized bomber flying at 30,000 feet, the mechanical safeties were alarmingly prone to failure. This realization ignited a secret war within the Pentagon, a conflict between civilian leadership and the military brass that would define nuclear protocol for decades. The solution proposed by the scientists at Sandia and supported by the White House was the installation of permissive action links, or PALs. These were essentially electronic combination locks inside the bombs. Even if a rogue general ordered a strike, or if a plane crashed and the crew went rogue, the weapon would be a dud unless a specific code, held by the president, was entered. It seemed like a logical safety measure. The military leadership, particularly General Curtis LeMay of the Strategic Air Command, despised the idea. LeMay viewed PALs as an insult to the integrity of his officers, and, more dangerously, a bottleneck that could prevent a retaliatory strike. In the grim logic of mutually assured destruction, speed was everything. If the Soviets launched a surprise attack, the U.S. needed to launch its bombers immediately. LeMay argued that fumbling with codes while Russian warheads were raining down could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The resistance was so fierce that for years the Air Force effectively malicious complianced the order. While they installed the PAL hardware to satisfy McNamara, reports surfaced decades later that the code on Minuteman missiles had been set to 0000000 for years, a code so simple that any launch crew could bypass it in seconds. The military prioritized the always, the bomb must always work when needed, over the never, the bomb must never work when not needed. Goldsboro was the terrifying proof that the never was hanging by a thread. The investigation into the Goldsboro crash also revealed the disturbing limitations of human engineering in the face of chaos. The Mark 39 bomb was designed to withstand the forces of a standard drop, or perhaps a rough landing. It was not designed to withstand the violent disintegration of a B-52G in midair. The aerodynamic forces that ripped the bomber apart created a unique environment that tricked the bomb's logic circuits. The smart weapon was fooled by a dumb accident. This led to a complete overhaul of how weapons were integrated into aircraft. Future designs would rely less on environmental sensing, like air pressure or spin, and more on positive control, direct electrical signals that could only come from a deliberate human action. The pre-arm circuits were redesigned to be physically isolated from the firing circuits, ensuring that a stray voltage from a short circuit, like the one that almost doomed North Carolina, could not jump the gap. The legacy of those two bombs in the mud was a new generation of weapons that were one-point safe, meaning that even if the high explosives detonated due to fire or impact, they would not compress the nuclear core symmetrically enough to cause a nuclear yield. But all the safety reviews and engineering upgrades in the world could not erase the chilling what-if scenario that haunted the dreams of those who knew the truth. If the switch on bomb number 1 had failed, if that single dollar's worth of copper and plastic had shorted out, the history of the 20th century would have ended on January 24, 1961. The detonation of a 3.8 megaton weapon is not merely a big explosion, it is a climate-altering event. The fireball would have touched the ground, sucking millions of tons of radioactive earth into the stratosphere. The wind patterns on that night were blowing north-northeast. The fallout plume, The lethal zone, where radiation sickness is 100% fatal, would have carved a scythe of death across the mid-Atlantic states. Richmond, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, all were in the potential downwind corridor. The panic would have triggered a total collapse of the U.S. government's command and control structure. The geopolitical consequences would have been even more catastrophic. In 1961, the trust between the U.S. and the USSR was non-existent. There was no red phone hotline yet. That would only be established after the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. If a thermonuclear mushroom cloud had risen over the American East Coast, the immediate assumption by the Strategic Air Command would not have been accident. It would have been sneak attack. The early warning radar systems would have been blinded by the electromagnetic pulse, EMP, from the blast. Communications would have been severed. In the confusion, with millions of Americans dead and the capital potentially irradiated, the pressure to launch a retaliatory strike against the Soviet Union would have been overwhelming. General LeMay, a man who famously advocated for preemptive strikes, might have unleashed the entire American arsenal before the dust had even settled. The Soviets, seeing a massive American launch, would have emptied their silos in return. The world could have ended because a B-52 had a fuel leak. The great filter of human civilization might not be a cosmic event, but a faulty toggle switch in a muddy field. Today, the site of the crash is indistinguishable from the surrounding farmland. There is no crater, no scorched earth, no monument to the near apocalypse. The easement purchased by the government is just a patch of trees and scrub brush, bordered by soybeans and corn. But to those who know what to look for, the signs are there. The groundwater is monitored regularly by the Department of Energy. The deeds to the surrounding properties carry strange covenants, and the locals, the children and grandchildren of the farmers who watched the sky fall, still tell the story. They tell it not as a triumph of technology, but as a testament to blind luck. They know that they are living on top of a dragon that is sleeping, not dead. The secondary stage of bomb number 2, encased in its concrete tomb deep beneath the water table, is still technically a classified nuclear component. It contains highly enriched uranium that will remain radioactive for millions of years, a silent, poisonous monument to the Cold War that will outlast the United States itself. The Goldsboro incident remains the ultimate cautionary tale of the nuclear age. It stripped away the illusion of control. We like to believe that our technologies are subservient to us, that we are the masters of the atom. But for a few seconds in 1961, the atom was the master. The machines we built to ensure our security conspired to destroy us, and we were saved not by our brilliance, but by the random failure of a circuit. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How many other switches have failed that we don't know about? How many other times has the world stood on the edge of the precipice, only to be pulled back by a fluke of physics? The official record lists Goldsboro as a broken arrow, an accident. But to historians of the nuclear age, it is something far more profound. It is the moment we realized that in the game of mutually assured destruction, we were playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. And the only reason we didn't blow our brains out was that the trigger jammed. As the years pass, the memory of the B-52 disintegrating in the night sky fades, but the lesson endures. Technology is fallible. Humans are fallible. And when you combine fallible humans with apocalyptic technology, survival is not a guarantee. It is a statistical anomaly. The switch that saved North Carolina sits in a museum now, a small, unassuming piece of industrial plastic. It looks like something you would use to turn on a coffee maker. But it is arguably the most important artifact of the 20th century. It is the physical embodiment of the thin line between the world we know and a radioactive wasteland. Every time a B-52 took off, every time a missile was loaded into a silo, that line was tested. At Goldsboro, the line held, but only just. And in the silence of that field, where the Geiger counters still occasionally tick a little faster than normal, the Earth remembers how close we came to the fire. The buried bomb is not just a hazard. It is a message from the past, buried in a time capsule of mud and concrete, warning the future that the most dangerous weapon in the world is not the one in the enemy's hands, but the one in your own.